Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellow documents emerged from the depths of the provincial archives of Quebec in the autumn of 1987, discovered by chance during routine cataloguing of 18th century colonial records. Dr. Helena Rousseau, the chief archivist, would later describe the moment as profoundly unsettling, not merely for the content of the papers, but for the inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from the leather portfolio bearing the seal of the defunct Seigneurie of Montclair. The collection consisted of 17 letters, 3 medical testimonies, a fragmentary journal, and what appeared to be official correspondence between colonial administrators and the Catholic Church hierarchy of New France. All documents bore dates between 1748 and 1751, originating from a remote settlement along the St. Lawrence River, some 40 leagues northeast of Quebec City. The settlement itself had vanished from historical records by 1755, its existence known only through scattered references in territorial surveys and tax rolls. The initial letter, penned in the careful script of Father Augustin Mercier, parish priest of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, addressed his ecclesiastical superior with evident distress. The priest described his arrival at the Montclair estate in response to urgent summons from the local magistrate, one Philippe Durand. The estate, he noted, stood isolated on a promontory overlooking the river, its imposing stone manor house surrounded by dense forests that seemed to press against the very foundations with unnatural persistence. Father Mercier's account detailed his first encounter with the Montclair sisters, Isabelle, aged 26, and Céleste, 24, who had inherited the substantial property following their father's death the previous winter. Both women had married within months of their inheritance, taking as husbands 2 brothers from the neighboring Beaumont family, Isabelle to Jean-Baptiste and Céleste to François Xavier. The priest noted with particular unease that the marriages had been conducted in haste without the customary bans or proper ecclesiastical oversight. The circumstances that prompted Father Mercier's visit remained deliberately vague in his initial correspondence, though he alluded to reports from local habitants regarding strange occurrences at the manor. Servants had fled their positions without explanation, and the few who remained spoke in whispers of nocturnal activities that defied Christian understanding. The priest's language grew increasingly circumspect as he described his observations, employing euphemisms and biblical references that suggested matters too delicate for direct discourse. Dr. Rousseau's examination of the documents revealed peculiarities that extended beyond their disturbing content. The paper itself exhibited an unusual discoloration, not the typical browning of age, but rather dark stains that seemed to have penetrated the fibers in irregular patterns. Chemical analysis would later prove inconclusive, though laboratory technicians reported an inexplicable reluctance to handle the materials for extended periods. The handwriting throughout the collection displayed remarkable consistency, despite originating from multiple sources over several years. This uniformity troubled paleographic experts, who noted that individual scribal characteristics typically varied significantly even within single documents of the period. More unsettling still was the discovery that several letters bore dates that contradicted established historical chronology, references to events that had not yet occurred when the documents were supposedly written. Father Mercier's subsequent letters grew increasingly agitated in tone, though his meaning remained obscured by layers of theological metaphor and classical allusion. He wrote of witnessing rituals that perverted the sacred bonds of matrimony, transforming the marriage bed into an altar of unholy communion. The priest's descriptions suggested practices that violated not merely Christian doctrine, but the fundamental order of nature itself, though he never provided explicit details of what he claimed to have observed. The medical testimonies, signed by one Dr. Antoine Lavallee of Quebec City, offered a more clinical perspective on the events at Montclair. The physician had been summoned to examine the Beaumont brothers following what he termed a severe deterioration in their physical and mental faculties. His notes described symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding: a progressive wasting of the body accompanied by an unnatural pallor, episodes of cataleptic rigidity alternating with periods of violent agitation, and most disturbing of all, what he characterized as a complete reversal of the natural masculine temperament. Dr. Lavallee's observations extended to the sisters themselves, whom he found to exhibit a vitality that seemed to increase in direct proportion to their husbands' decline. He noted their unnaturally luminous complexion, their apparent immunity to the harsh Canadian winter, and their ability to maintain perfect composure even during their spouses' most violent episodes. The physician's final entry, dated 3 weeks before his death from fever, contained a single cryptic line that would haunt subsequent investigators: "The natural order has been inverted, and what should give life now consumes it." The official inquiry into the affairs of the Montclair estate began in earnest during the harsh winter of 1749, when Magistrate Philippe Durand received a formal complaint from the surviving members of the Beaumont family. The accusation, delivered by the brothers' elderly uncle Gaspard Beaumont, alleged that Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier had fallen under some form of malevolent influence that had rendered them unrecognizable to their own kin. Durand's investigative records, preserved in meticulous detail within the discovered archive, painted a portrait of systematic inquiry hampered by inexplicable obstacles. The magistrate, a man of considerable experience in colonial jurisprudence, found himself confronting testimonies that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. His initial interviews with local habitants revealed a pattern of disturbing observations that had accumulated over the preceding months. The blacksmith, Pierre Gagnon, reported that the Beaumont brothers had ceased their regular visits to his forge, despite their previous reputation for maintaining their equipment with obsessive care. When they did appear, Gagnon noted, they moved with an unnatural languor, their eyes fixed upon some distant point that seemed to exist beyond the physical world. Most troubling was their apparent indifference to pain. François Xavier had placed his bare hand upon red-hot iron without reaction, the flesh searing while his expression remained utterly serene. Marie-Claire Dubois, the village midwife, provided testimony that proved particularly unsettling to the magistrate. She described being summoned to the manor on 3 separate occasions, ostensibly to attend to the sisters' health. Each visit had revealed the same peculiar circumstances. The sisters displayed a vitality that seemed almost supernatural, their skin luminous with an inner radiance that defied the harsh winter conditions. Their husbands, by contrast, appeared increasingly frail, as though some essential element of their being was being systematically drained away. The midwife's most disturbing observation concerned the nature of the marital chambers themselves. She reported that the rooms had been extensively modified, with heavy curtains blocking all natural light and strange symbols carved into the wooden beams. The air within these spaces carried an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult, and she noted the presence of an odor that she could only describe as resembling copper, mixed with something organic and corrupt. Durand's personal examination of the manor house provided additional evidence of the household's deviation from normal domestic arrangements. The magistrate documented architectural alterations that served no apparent practical purpose. Walls had been removed to create unusually large chambers, while others had been reinforced with iron brackets of unknown function. The cellars, traditionally used for food storage, had been converted into spaces that defied easy categorization, rooms lined with mirrors and furnished with objects whose purpose remained obscure. The magistrate's interviews with the Montclair sisters themselves proved particularly challenging. Isabelle and Celeste received him with perfect courtesy, their manners reflecting the finest aristocratic education. Yet Durand noted in his private journal that their responses to his inquiries possessed a quality that he found deeply unsettling. They answered his questions with precision, while somehow conveying the impression that they were discussing matters of no consequence whatsoever. When questioned about their husband's deteriorating condition, the sisters expressed appropriate concern while displaying no genuine emotion. They attributed the men's decline to the rigors of colonial life and the harsh climate, explanations that might have satisfied a less observant investigator. However, Durand noted that their eyes betrayed a knowledge that their words carefully concealed, an awareness of truths that they had no intention of revealing. The magistrate's most significant discovery occurred during his examination of the manor's library, where he uncovered a collection of texts that had no place in a respectable colonial household. The volumes, bound in leather of unusual texture and color, contained writings in languages that Durand could not identify. Several books appeared to be much older than the manor itself, their pages filled with diagrams and illustrations that depicted human figures in configurations that violated both natural law and Christian morality. Father Mercier's assistance in translating portions of these texts revealed content that the priest refused to discuss in detail. The cleric's notes, preserved among the archive documents, suggested that the books contained instructions for practices that inverted the natural relationship between husband and wife, transforming the sacred act of marriage into something that served purposes beyond human understanding. The investigation took a decisive turn when Durand attempted to interview the Beaumont brothers directly. Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier appeared before him in a state that defied medical explanation. Their physical deterioration had progressed to an alarming degree. Both men had lost considerable weight. Their skin had acquired a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath, and their movements suggested a disconnection from their own bodies. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to focus upon the magistrate's questions. The brothers' attention seemed perpetually drawn toward the upper floors of the manor, where their wives maintained their private chambers. When pressed for details about their daily routines, both men provided responses that suggested their memories had become fragmentary and unreliable. They spoke of nights that lasted for days and days that passed in moments, of experiences that they could not adequately describe, but which had fundamentally altered their understanding of existence itself. Durand's final interview notes contained the observation that would prove prophetic. The magistrate suspected that whatever was occurring within the Montclair manor represented not merely a violation of law and custom, but a fundamental challenge to the natural order that governed human relationships. Dr. Antoine Lavalley's detailed medical journal, discovered among the archive documents, provided the most systematic examination of the physical and psychological deterioration observed in the Beaumont brothers. The physician, summoned from Quebec City in February of 1750, arrived at the Montclair estate with the expectation of treating what he assumed to be a conventional malady affecting the colonial household. His initial assessment of Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier revealed symptoms that challenged every principle of medical science he had acquired during his studies at the University of Paris. The brothers exhibited a condition that Lavalley characterized as a progressive consumption of vital essence, though no conventional disease could account for the specific nature of their decline. Their bodies appeared to be undergoing a transformation that defied natural law, as though some fundamental aspect of their masculine constitution was being systematically extracted. The physician's examination revealed that both men had lost nearly 30 pounds since their marriages, yet their muscle tone remained surprisingly intact. Their skin had acquired an unusual translucency, that allowed the circulation of blood to be observed with disturbing clarity. Most peculiar was the discovery that their body temperature had dropped several degrees below normal, yet they showed no signs of the lethargy typically associated with such hypothermia. Instead, they displayed a restless energy that seemed disconnected from their physical condition. Lavallee's neurological assessments proved equally confounding. The brothers demonstrated reflexes that operated independently of conscious control, responding to stimuli that the physician could not detect. Their pupils dilated and contracted in patterns that bore no relationship to changes in light, and their pulse rates fluctuated wildly without apparent cause. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to maintain focus on immediate surroundings, as though their consciousness had become partially detached from their physical forms. The physician's attempts to interview the brothers about their symptoms yielded responses that suggested a fundamental alteration in their perception of reality. Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier described experiences that bore no resemblance to normal human sensation. They spoke of feeling simultaneously empty and overwhelmed, of existing in multiple states of being, and of participating in activities that they could not clearly remember, but which left them profoundly changed. Lavallee's examination of the sisters provided an equally disturbing contrast to their husbands' condition. Isabelle and Celeste exhibited a vitality that seemed to exceed normal human parameters. Their skin possessed a luminosity that the physician initially attributed to cosmetic enhancement, until closer inspection revealed that the radiance emanated from within. Their physical strength appeared to have increased significantly since their marriages, and they demonstrated an immunity to fatigue that defied medical explanation. The sisters' physiological responses to standard medical tests revealed anomalies that Lavallee struggled to document in scientific terms. Their pulse rates remained remarkably steady, regardless of physical exertion. Their breathing patterns showed no variation under stress, and their reflexes operated with a precision that suggested supernatural enhancement. Most unsettling was their apparent ability to perceive the physician's thoughts and intentions before he expressed them, responding to questions he had not yet asked. Lavallee's investigation of the manor's domestic arrangements revealed modifications that served no apparent medical purpose, but which seemed designed to facilitate activities that the physician could only describe in euphemistic terms. The marital chambers had been equipped with restraining devices that bore no resemblance to conventional medical apparatus, yet which showed clear signs of regular use. The rooms contained vessels filled with substances that the physician could not identify, though their organic nature was unmistakable. The physician's most significant discovery occurred during his examination of the manor's cellar chambers, where he encountered evidence of practices that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The spaces had been converted into what could only be described as laboratories for the systematic manipulation of human physiology. Tables bore stains that suggested regular use for procedures that Lavallee preferred not to contemplate, while shelves contained implements whose purpose remained mercifully obscure. Lavallee's final medical assessment, completed shortly before his departure from the estate, concluded that the Beaumont brothers were undergoing a transformation that exceeded the boundaries of conventional medicine. He theorized that some form of systematic extraction was occurring, though he could not identify the mechanism or the ultimate purpose of such procedures. His recommendation for immediate intervention proved prophetic, though the nature of that intervention would require resources beyond the scope of medical science. The physician's personal notes, written in cipher and decoded only decades later, revealed his growing conviction that the sisters possessed knowledge of practices that predated Christian civilization. He suspected that their activities represented not merely a violation of moral law, but an attempt to access powers that humanity was never intended to wield. His final entry, penned with evident haste, contained a warning that would prove tragically accurate. The natural order itself was under assault within the walls of the Montclair manor. Among the most disturbing documents within the archive was a leather-bound journal discovered sealed within a hidden compartment of the manor's library. The journal, written in the hand of Jean-Baptiste Beaumont himself, provided an intimate account of the gradual transformation that had overtaken his existence following his marriage to Isabelle Montclair. The entries, spanning nearly 18 months, chronicled a descent into circumstances that defied rational comprehension. The earliest entries, dated shortly after the wedding ceremony in March of 1748, reflected the conventional expectations of a colonial gentleman entering into matrimonial union. Jean-Baptiste wrote with evident satisfaction about his acquisition of substantial property and his alliance with one of the region's most prominent families. His descriptions of Isabelle portrayed a woman of exceptional beauty and refinement, whose education and accomplishments exceeded those typically found in colonial society. However, subtle indications of unusual circumstances appeared within weeks of the marriage. Jean-Baptiste noted that his wife maintained nocturnal habits that seemed inconsistent with conventional domestic routines. She retired to her private chambers each evening at sunset, remaining secluded until the following dawn. During these hours, he reported hearing sounds that he initially attributed to household maintenance, but which gradually took on qualities that disturbed his sleep and invaded his dreams. The journal entries from summer of 1748 revealed Jean-Baptiste's growing awareness that his marital relationship differed fundamentally from normal conjugal arrangements. His wife's approach to intimate relations involved practices that he struggled to describe in written form, employing euphemisms and classical references that barely concealed their disturbing nature. He wrote of ceremonies that transformed the marriage bed into something resembling an altar, where conventional roles became inverted and natural instincts were systematically suppressed. Jean-Baptiste's physical condition began to deteriorate noticeably by autumn, though he attributed his declining health to the demands of managing the estate. His journal entries became increasingly fragmented, with gaps in memory that he could not explain. He described periods of consciousness that seemed to exist outside normal temporal boundaries, where hours passed like minutes and minutes stretched into eternities. During these episodes, he experienced sensations that he characterized as simultaneously pleasurable and terrifying. The winter entries of 1748 marked a decisive shift in the journal's tone and content. Jean-Baptiste's handwriting became increasingly erratic, with words occasionally trailing off mid-sentence or resuming without apparent connection to previous thoughts. He wrote of participating in activities that he could not clearly remember, but which left him fundamentally changed. His description suggested that the boundaries between his individual consciousness and some larger, more encompassing awareness had begun to dissolve. Most disturbing were Jean-Baptiste's accounts of his wife's transformation during their intimate encounters. He described Isabelle as assuming qualities that transcended normal human capabilities, displaying strength and endurance that seemed to draw upon sources beyond physical limitation. Her touch produced effects that he compared to electrical phenomena, creating sensations that penetrated beyond mere physical contact to affect the very essence of his being. The journal revealed that Jean-Baptiste had become aware of his brother's parallel experience with Celeste, though the two men rarely discussed their circumstances directly. François Xavier exhibited the same progressive deterioration, the same fragmentation of memory and consciousness, the same gradual surrender of individual will to forces that operated beyond their comprehension. The brothers had become participants in a process that they could neither understand nor resist. Jean-Baptiste's entries from spring of 1749 suggested that his transformation had reached a critical threshold. He wrote of existing in multiple states simultaneously, of experiencing reality through perspectives that were not entirely his own. His sense of individual identity had become fluid, merging with consciousness that encompassed experiences and knowledge that predated his birth. During intimate encounters with Isabel, he reported accessing memories that belonged to other men, other times, other circumstances entirely. The journal's most revealing passages concerned Jean-Baptiste's growing understanding of his wife's true nature and purposes. He had begun to perceive Isabel not as an individual woman, but as a conduit for forces that operated according to principles that inverted natural law. Through their marital union, she was accessing and redirecting energies that conventional understanding could not acknowledge. The process required the systematic dissolution of masculine essence, transforming vital force into something that could be harvested and redirected toward purposes that remained beyond his comprehension. The final entries, written in increasingly illegible script, suggested that Jean-Baptiste had achieved a state of awareness that transcended normal human consciousness while simultaneously destroying his capacity for independent existence. He wrote of understanding truths that could not be communicated through conventional language, of participating in activities that served purposes extending far beyond individual desire or satisfaction. His last coherent entry contained a single haunting observation. He had become something other than human while retaining enough of his original consciousness to comprehend the magnitude of his transformation. The ecclesiastical investigation into the Montclair affair commenced in earnest during the spring of 1750, when Father Mercier's increasingly desperate correspondence finally prompted intervention from the Bishop of Quebec. Monseigneur Jean-Baptiste de Pontbriand dispatched Father Etienne Roussel, a specialist in matters of spiritual aberration, to conduct a formal inquiry into the allegations that had begun to circulate throughout the colonial administration. Father Roussel's preliminary report, preserved in the diocesan archives and later transferred to the provincial collection, documented his initial assessment of the manor and its inhabitants. The priest, a man of considerable theological education and practical experience in confronting spiritual irregularities, found himself unprepared for the subtlety and sophistication of the forces he encountered at the Montclair estate. His first observation concerned the manor's atmosphere itself, which seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight regardless of the time of day or season. Natural light appeared to be absorbed by the building's very structure, creating an environment where shadows possessed substance and weight. The priest noted that his prayers, normally a source of comfort and strength, seemed to dissipate before reaching their intended destination, as though some invisible barrier prevented divine intervention from penetrating the estate's boundaries. Father Roussel's examination of the manor's chapel revealed the most immediate evidence of spiritual corruption. The sacred space had been systematically desecrated through modifications that inverted traditional Christian symbolism. Crosses had been mounted in configurations that created geometric patterns of unknown significance, while the altar itself bore stains that suggested its use for purposes that violated every principle of sacred ritual. The priest discovered that holy water brought onto the premises underwent a transformation that rendered it not merely ineffective, but actively repellent to blessed objects. The ecclesiastical investigation extended to the extensive library that the Montclair family had accumulated over generations. Father Roussel's examination of the collection revealed texts that had no place in a Christian household, works that predated the arrival of Christianity in Europe and contained knowledge that the Church had spent centuries attempting to suppress. Many volumes appeared to be written in languages that the priest could not identify, though their illustrations conveyed meanings that required no translation. Most disturbing among these texts were those that dealt explicitly with the manipulation of marital bonds for purposes that transcended human understanding. The books contained detailed instructions for practices that transformed the sacred union of marriage into a mechanism for accessing powers that operated beyond the natural world. Father Roussel's notes indicated that these practices required the systematic dissolution of masculine essence through intimate encounters that inverted the divine order of creation. The priest's attempts to interview the Montclair sisters proved particularly challenging, as their responses demonstrated a theological sophistication that exceeded his own. Isabelle and Celeste engaged with his questions, using scriptural references and patristic quotations that revealed an intimate knowledge of Christian doctrine, yet their interpretations consistently inverted traditional meanings. They spoke of marriage as a sacrament designed to facilitate the transformation of human consciousness, describing their relationships with their husbands as spiritual exercises that served purposes beyond individual salvation. Father Roussel's examination of the Beaumont brothers confirmed the medical assessments provided by Dr. Lavallee while adding a spiritual dimension to their condition. The priest observed that both men exhibited signs of what he characterized as progressive soul displacement, as though their essential spiritual nature was being systematically extracted and replaced with something fundamentally alien. Their responses to religious symbols and prayers suggested that their connection to divine grace had been severed, leaving them vulnerable to influences that operated outside Christian protection. The ecclesiastical investigation revealed that the sisters possessed knowledge of practices that predated Christian civilization by millennia. Their activities represented not merely a violation of moral law, but an attempt to access powers that the early church had recognized as fundamentally incompatible with human spiritual development. Father Roussel theorized that the Montclair lineage had preserved ancient knowledge through generations of careful concealment, waiting for circumstances that would permit its practical application. The priest's most significant discovery occurred during his examination of the manor's cellar chambers, where he encountered physical evidence of rituals that combined elements of pre-Christian fertility cults with practices derived from sources that he could not identify. The spaces had been arranged to facilitate ceremonies that transformed intimate human contact into a mechanism for channeling forces that operated according to principles that inverted natural law. Father Roussel's final report to the bishop contained a recommendation for immediate and decisive intervention, though he acknowledged that conventional ecclesiastical remedies might prove inadequate to address the situation. His assessment concluded that the Montclair sisters had achieved a level of spiritual corruption that placed them beyond the reach of normal redemption, while their husbands had become unwilling participants in a process that threatened to spread beyond the estate's boundaries if left unchecked. The culminating phase of the investigation into the Montclair affair produced a series of testimonies that would forever alter the understanding of those involved in documenting the case. During the autumn of 1750, as colonial authorities prepared to take decisive action against the estate, several key witnesses provided final accounts that revealed the true scope of the transformation that had occurred within the manor's walls. Marie-Claire Dubois, the village midwife who had maintained periodic contact with the household, submitted a detailed statement to Magistrate Durand that described her final visit to the estate in September of that year. Her account revealed that the physical deterioration of the Beaumont brothers had progressed beyond anything she had previously witnessed in her decades of medical practice. Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier had become barely recognizable as the robust young men who had arrived at the manor 2 years earlier. The midwife's observations indicated that the brothers now existed in a state that defied conventional understanding of human consciousness. Their bodies moved with mechanical precision, performing tasks and responding to stimuli, yet their eyes reflected an emptiness that suggested the absence of individual will or awareness. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to recognize familiar faces or respond to their own names, as though their personal identities had been completely erased. Dubois noted that the sisters, by contrast, had undergone a transformation that enhanced rather than diminished their human capabilities. Isabelle and Céleste displayed a vitality that seemed to increase with each passing month, their physical beauty reaching levels that appeared almost supernatural. Their movements possessed a grace that transcended normal human limitations, and their presence commanded attention in ways that the midwife found both compelling and deeply unsettling. The most revealing testimony came from Father Roussel's final interview with the estate's remaining servant, an elderly woman named Brigitte Moreau, who had served the Montclair family for over 3 decades. Moreau's account, given under oath and sealed by ecclesiastical authority, provided unprecedented insight into the daily routines that had developed within the manor during the preceding months. The servant described a household that operated according to rhythms that bore no relationship to natural cycles of day and night. The sisters maintained schedules that seemed to exist outside normal temporal boundaries, conducting their most significant activities during hours when conventional society slept. Moreau reported witnessing preparations for ceremonies that transformed the manor's upper chambers into spaces that served purposes she could not adequately describe. Most disturbing were the servant's observations regarding the nature of the intimate encounters between the sisters and their husbands. Moreau described sounds that emanated from the marital chambers during these sessions, not the typical expressions of human passion, but vocalizations that seemed to originate from sources beyond individual consciousness. The encounters appeared to follow ritualistic patterns that repeated with mechanical precision, suggesting that spontaneous human emotion had been replaced by systematic procedure. The servant's testimony revealed that the Beaumont brothers had become participants in activities that extended far beyond conventional marital relations. Their wives had transformed them into instruments for accessing energies that operated according to principles that inverted natural law. During these encounters, the men appeared to exist in states of consciousness that transcended normal human awareness, while simultaneously draining their capacity for independent thought or action. Dr. Lavallee's final medical assessment, completed shortly before his departure from the region, provided scientific documentation of the brothers' condition that corroborated the servant's observations. The physician noted that Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier had achieved a state of physical existence that challenged every principle of medical science. Their bodies continued to function despite the apparent absence of the vital forces that normally sustained human life. The doctor's examination revealed that the brothers' physiological processes had been fundamentally altered through their participation in the sisters' rituals. Their circulation, respiration, and neurological functions operated according to patterns that bore no resemblance to normal human biology. Most significantly, they appeared to have developed a dependency upon their wives, presence that transcended psychological attachment, suggesting that their continued existence required regular exposure to the energies that the sisters channeled through their intimate encounters. Father Roussel's final ecclesiastical assessment concluded that the Montclair sisters had achieved a level of spiritual mastery that placed them beyond the reach of conventional religious intervention. Their knowledge and practices represented a synthesis of ancient wisdom and contemporary application that had successfully inverted the natural order within their domain. The priest's recommendation for immediate action reflected his conviction that the situation had progressed beyond the point where peaceful resolution remained possible. The testimonies collectively painted a picture of systematic transformation that had converted a conventional colonial household into something that operated according to principles that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Christian civilization. The evidence suggested that the sisters had successfully implemented practices that accessed powers predating human understanding, using their marital relationships as conduits for energies that served purposes beyond individual satisfaction or conventional spiritual development. The coordinated intervention at the Montclair estate commenced on the night of October 31st, 1750, a date chosen deliberately by Father Roussel for its significance in both Christian and pre-Christian traditions. The operation involved a carefully selected group of colonial officials, ecclesiastical authorities, and armed militia, all sworn to secrecy regarding the true nature of their mission. Magistrate Durand's official records, sealed for nearly 2 centuries, documented the events of that night with meticulous precision. The approach to the manor revealed immediate evidence that the estate's inhabitants had anticipated the intervention. The building itself seemed to pulse with an energy that made the very air difficult to breathe, while an unnatural fog had settled over the grounds despite the clear autumn sky. The militia reported that their horses refused to advance beyond the estate's boundaries, forcing the intervention party to proceed on foot through terrain that seemed to shift and change beneath their steps. Father Roussel's account described the manor as existing in a state of heightened spiritual activity that defied conventional understanding. The windows glowed with a light that bore no resemblance to normal illumination, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The priest noted that his blessed objects had begun to vibrate with increasing intensity as the party approached the main entrance, suggesting the presence of forces that actively opposed divine intervention. The initial entry into the manor revealed a household that had been transformed beyond recognition. The interior spaces had been reconfigured into arrangements that served no apparent domestic purpose, with furniture and fixtures positioned to create geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to observe directly. The air itself carried a weight that made movement difficult, while sounds seemed to originate from sources that could not be located within the physical structure. Magistrate Durand's search of the lower floors uncovered evidence of activities that exceeded even the most disturbing testimonies previously collected. The main hall had been converted into a ceremonial space where conventional Christian symbols had been inverted and combined with iconography that predated European civilization. The walls bore inscriptions in languages that Father Roussel could not identify, though their meanings seemed to penetrate consciousness through channels that bypassed rational comprehension. The discovery of the Beaumont brothers in the manor's library provided the most shocking revelation of the intervention. Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier were found seated in identical positions, their eyes open but reflecting no awareness of their surroundings. Their bodies showed signs of the extreme deterioration documented in previous medical examinations, yet they continued to breathe and respond to basic stimuli. Most disturbing was their apparent inability to recognize the intervention party or respond to their own names. Dr. Lavallee's immediate examination of the brothers revealed that their condition had progressed to a state that challenged the very definition of human existence. Their pulse rates had synchronized to an identical rhythm that bore no relationship to normal cardiac function, while their breathing patterns followed sequences that seemed designed to facilitate altered states of consciousness. The physician noted that both men appeared to exist in a state of suspended animation, their bodies maintained through processes that operated beyond medical understanding. The search for the Montclair sisters led the intervention party to the manor's upper chambers, where they encountered evidence of the rituals that had transformed the household. The marital rooms had been extensively modified to accommodate ceremonies that combined elements of ancient fertility cults with practices derived from sources that Father Roussel characterized as fundamentally opposed to Christian doctrine. The spaces contained implements and substances that served purposes the priest refused to document in detail, However, Isabel and Celeste themselves were nowhere to be found within the manor's physical structure. The intervention party conducted an exhaustive search of every room, cellar and outbuilding without discovering any trace of the sisters' presence. Most puzzling was the discovery that their personal belongings remained undisturbed, suggesting that their absence was not the result of conventional departure. The militia's examination of the estate's grounds revealed additional mysteries that deepened the investigation's complexity. Tracks in the soft earth around the manor indicated that the sisters had been present as recently as the previous evening. Yet the trail ended abruptly at the edge of the formal gardens without any indication of their destination. Local habitants reported no sightings of the women despite the estate's isolation, making unobserved departure virtually impossible. Father Roussel's final assessment of the manor concluded that the sisters had achieved a level of mastery over natural forces that permitted them to transcend physical limitations. The priest theorized that their prolonged practice of ancient rituals had granted them capabilities that exceeded normal human boundaries, allowing them to exist in states that conventional understanding could not acknowledge. The intervention's most disturbing discovery was the realization that the transformation of the Beaumont brothers appeared to be irreversible. Despite the removal of the sisters' direct influence, the men showed no signs of recovery or return to normal consciousness. Their condition suggested that the rituals had created changes that persisted independently of their wives' presence, leaving them trapped in a state that existed between life and something far more troubling. The aftermath of the intervention at the Montclair estate left colonial authorities grappling with questions that defied conventional resolution. The official records, sealed by order of the Governor-General and marked for perpetual classification, documented the systematic dismantling of the manor and the disposition of its inhabitants, yet failed to provide satisfactory explanations for the phenomena that had been witnessed. The Beaumont brothers were transferred to a private facility operated by the Ursuline sisters in Quebec City, where they remained under constant medical and spiritual supervision. Dr. Lavallee's final reports indicated that Jean-Baptiste and François Xavier continued to exist in their altered state, showing no improvement despite the complete removal from their wives' influence. The men required assistance with basic functions, yet demonstrated an uncanny awareness of events occurring beyond their immediate environment, as though their consciousness operated according to principles that transcended physical limitations. Father Roussel's attempts to provide spiritual intervention for the brothers proved entirely unsuccessful. The men showed no response to religious ceremonies, blessed objects, or prayers, suggesting that their transformation had severed their connection to divine grace permanently. Most troubling was the discovery that their presence seemed to affect other patients within the facility, causing unexplained disturbances and behavioral changes that forced their isolation in specially constructed chambers. The Montclair manor itself was subjected to systematic deconsecration and demolition under ecclesiastical supervision. Father Roussel oversaw the removal and destruction of all materials that bore evidence of the sisters' activities, yet reported that the building seemed to resist these efforts through means that defied rational explanation. Tools broke without apparent cause, workers suffered inexplicable accidents, and the very stones seemed to emit emanations that made prolonged exposure dangerous to human health. The disposal of the manor's extensive library required special protocols developed specifically for materials deemed spiritually hazardous. The texts were transported under armed guard to Quebec City, where they were examined by a commission of theological scholars before being consigned to flames blessed by the bishop himself. However, several witnesses reported that certain volumes appeared to resist destruction, requiring multiple attempts before they would succumb to fire. The investigation into the sisters' disappearance continued for months without yielding any credible leads. Searches extended throughout the colonial territories and into the wilderness regions beyond settled boundaries. Yet no trace of Isabel and Celeste was ever discovered. Local inhabitants reported occasional sightings of figures matching their descriptions, but these accounts proved impossible to verify and often contained details that suggested supernatural rather than natural encounters. Most disturbing were reports that began to emerge from other colonial settlements regarding women who displayed characteristics similar to those observed in the Montclair sisters. These accounts, scattered across vast geographical distances, described individuals who possessed unusual knowledge of ancient practices and who seemed to exert inexplicable influence over their marital relationships. The pattern suggested that the sisters' activities might have been part of a larger phenomenon that extended far beyond the isolated estate on the St. Lawrence River. The colonial administration's response to these reports reflected a growing awareness that conventional legal and religious authorities might prove inadequate to address such matters. New protocols were established for investigating unusual domestic situations, while ecclesiastical authorities developed specialized procedures for identifying and containing spiritual aberrations. These measures, implemented quietly and without public acknowledgement, suggested that the Montclair affair had revealed vulnerabilities in colonial society that required ongoing vigilance. Dr. Rousseau's modern analysis of the archived documents has raised additional questions about the ultimate fate of all parties involved in the investigation. Records indicate that several key witnesses, including Dr. Lavallee and Magistrate Durand, died within months of the intervention under circumstances that medical authorities of the time found difficult to explain. Father Roussel survived longer, but reported experiencing recurring nightmares and spiritual disturbances that persisted until his death in 1762. The final mystery surrounding the Montclair affair concerns the ultimate disposition of the estate's land itself. Official records indicate that the property was transferred to the colonial government and subsequently granted to new settlers, yet no family ever successfully established permanent residence on the site. Multiple attempts at settlement failed due to unexplained difficulties that forced abandonment of the land, leaving it to return to wilderness. Contemporary investigators have noted that the location of the former Montclair estate remains identifiable through geographical surveys, yet attempts to locate physical evidence of the manor's existence have proven unsuccessful. The site appears to have been reclaimed by nature with unusual thoroughness, leaving no trace of the structures that once housed activities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human civilization. The archived documents themselves continue to present anomalies that defy conventional explanation, suggesting that the influence of the Montclair sisters may persist in forms that transcend physical presence, leaving questions that may never find resolution within the boundaries of rational inquiry. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.